Hi, I'm Kevin Lee with the E-Marketing Association. My day job is I run Did It, an 80-something person digital first ad agency. I also run a nonprofit called Giving Forward. Today, in my role as the owner of the E-Marketing Association, I'm here with Warren Zenna, who has started the Chief Revenue Officers Collective, I believe it is. And so I wanted to hear the origin story of that. A lot of organizations don't actually have chief revenue officers per se, right, as a role in the C-suite, but a lot more and more of them do, right? They have CMOs, but not all of them have CROs. And so I'd love to hear like the origin story behind the collective.
Well, thank you very much, Kevin. I appreciate you having me on. And yeah, it's the CRO Collective, which
CRO,
is
correct.
It's all fine. It's all good. Yeah. So thanks for the question, and thanks for having me on. So I won't give too much history because it'll be too long. But I grew up in sales. I've been in the agency sort of marketing services industry since the mid '90s, like '94. Mostly selling marketing services. Back then it was selling things a lot differently. Mostly it was actually originally creative services. I was selling like web development and, app development stuff. And then as advertising became more sophisticated and, became the where the money was coming from, I migrated more into doing more of that sort of, media-based strategy and other things. And I had stints at Publicis where I oversaw one of their business units and had my own agency for a while. I still do, actually. My agency is still thriving, where I have worked with B2B companies, almost predominantly helping them with their marketing, and ran sales teams, ran big sales teams, small sales teams, was a good seller, became one of those sort of like sales guys that learns how to read spin selling and, all that stuff. And trained a lot of salespeople, then got a role at Havas where I oversaw one of their global North American business units. And this is where I started to coalesce things because here I was selling marketing services. So there's an interesting thing right there, right? So people sell a lot of things. Some people sell engine parts. But I was selling marketing services, which sort of had me understand sales and marketing to the same level of depth, right? Because I became a really good seller, and then I sort of became the product. I started to become a marketer, and then I started a marketing agency that I could then sell. So I sort of had that revenue side of the business really well understood in my brain, and I was able to deliver both. Then I became a buyer, right? So then now I'm in a position, I have a P&L, I have a budget, and I have to buy technology services to help enable my team to deliver marketing and advertising services. And I was the only guy at the agency, or maybe one of few at the agency, that was looking at these conversations with a much different perspective. Imagine, here I am, I'm a salesperson. I was selling advertising services, selling tech, and now I'm buying tech. I was like the worst person to sell to. I was the worst person to sell to. So these guys would come in and they would sell, and I started noticing things that I had picked up before, but it all sort of coalesced for me that the sales process was a window into how a lot of these B2B companies operate. And I started seeing how the marketing and the sales were completely misaligned. And everyone knows this, right? This is like the worst kept secret in the B2B space is that no sales and marketing organizations are aligned. But that's the problem, is that it's sort of accepted as like just a nature of business. Yeah, I know they're not going to be aligned and you deal with it. I don't agree with that. I actually kind of uncovered a problem, and that is that the chief revenue officer role is really the role that's intended to actually build that alignment. Like the proper appointment of a chief revenue officer is to oversee the entire revenue function, which includes customer success, sales, and marketing. And all three of those are the most customer facing and not the only customer facing parts of the business. And that's where the revenue comes from. And customer centricity would be an adherent to a successful business. And a good CRO should be focusing on overseeing all three of those functions and creating an aligned revenue operation that actually builds a more cohesive and aligned revenue operation. And that would solve many, if not, my opinion, all of the problems that B2B companies face in terms of their misalignment issues, which costs them billions of dollars, by the way. It's a very expensive issue. So I created the CRO Collective. It occurred to me, there's no one supporting chief revenue officers, which is nuts. This is a really important job, right? And they're being hired a lot more. They're being hired incorrectly. The role is undefined. It's completely misaligned. No one knows really what a chief revenue officer is supposed to do. Like 8 different opinions about it. But predominantly they're being hired as salespeople, which is wrong. Actually exacerbates the problems I just alluded to. So I'm training CROs and I'm helping CEOs realign their organizations and be what I call CRO ready organizations, to build actual companies that are built for CROs to succeed, so that both succeed. The CEO mitigates the risk of making this massive hire, and the CRO succeeds because he has an organization that's designed and set up for the role to flourish in the way that I describe. So that's what I'm doing. And I have training programs, and I have consultancies, and I have a different programs, plus a community of CROs that I'm kind of promulgating to help bring more awareness and better understanding of how the role should be applied. So that's a long answer, but that's essentially what I'm doing.
Great, great. Well, yeah, I'll agree with you that we've certainly, as an agency ourselves, we've seen dysfunction when we're pitching B2B marketing organizations, regardless of whether they're SaaS or otherwise. And we always do our best to help break down the silos and invent ways to break down the silos. But what was interesting to me about your description of sort of your journey through this is, it sounds like in the case of B2B businesses, you're sort of advocating that the CMO report to the CRO.
100% yes. And a lot of people are pissed at me about this, but tough. It's the right thing to do. And the reality is, the reason it's the right thing to do is because, let's talk about the CMO for a second, which I have a lot of respect for marketing, right? I mean, I grew up selling marketing, so believe me, there's no knock on marketing, which gets a lot of knocks, frankly. It's a shame. But the reality is that if you look at a B2B company, particularly the companies you and I are familiar with, they're primarily focused with revenue. They're primarily focused with pipeline building and customer acquisition. And they'll throw a bunch of salespeople out in the marketplace and try and put as many phones and as many, technologies and, other platforms in front of customers as they possibly can, because that's their primary goal. And I'll get into some reasons why this is a problem, but that's a fact. So the CMO's job is to support that, right? And add an additive to creating the right awareness in the marketplace that kind of softens the marketplace, so that the salespeople can have a market that's better tenderized to receive the message, right?
Better ready.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and so if you look at the way that the CRO role is aligned in the way that I'm proposing, the marketing, sales, and customer success functions should be all peers. They should be equal peers. There shouldn't be some senior person in the 3 of them. And the CMO role is doled out a lot more liberally than a CRO role is, right? There's a lot lower trepidation in hiring a CRO, whereas they'll give the head of marketing a CMO role next Tuesday. And what ends up happening now is, because that title has a C in front of it, that person almost sort of becomes untouchable in a way, because the person's not placed in a position of hierarchical authority that, in my opinion, many times is above what it should be, because it sort of creates an imbalance in things. And this is part of the problem. So if you hire a chief revenue officer and you already have a CMO, you're actually going to have a collision. I actually have a solution for that, but yes. So the CMO should in fact report up to someone who oversees a revenue team. And that's a tough negotiation, right? And I understand the delicacy of that, but it does in fact work better. So I apologize again for my lengthy answer, but it's an important topic that you mentioned. I think it's not a small thing.
Yeah, I mean, you're trying to solve a fairly it's a problem where it's made overly complex, perhaps, even though
it has been overcomplicated for sure. Right. Yes.
So I guess my follow-up question to that is, given the fact that the CRO should not be the same as the biz dev officer, right?
Absolutely not.
That perhaps a chief sales officer role should be the peer of the CMO, and then you've got
that is right.
Someone who's in charge of maximizing ongoing revenue.
That is correct.
A customer success person, right? Yep. And they all roll up into this.
That's right. CMO. That's right. So I have a little diagram I use, but you can envision it's not that complicated. But there should be sort of a chief revenue officer who reports into the CEO. It's a critical relationship. And then the CRO should have a head of sales, a head of marketing, and a head of customer success that report into that CRO. And those three should be equal. There should be no hierarchical, difference between the three of them. And they should be partners in building a aligned and cohesive revenue operation that has the customer at the center, which is why the customer success organization is critical, because the insights of customer onboarding and customer success, et cetera, inform, right, in an ongoing sort of feedback loop, the way that the customer experiences. Now that's going to be a great derivative of how marketing goes to market. Now sales goes to market, and that's not the case usually. Let me turn this off. It's usually not the case. What ends up usually happening, unfortunately, is customer success is tossed under operations, which is really bizarre. And so what ends up happening as a result is it's sort of siloed away, and that's like gold, the stuff that's going on in customer success. That's where, that stuff should be part of it. And if you don't really force a operational alignment around those things, a lot of times it just isn't done. Sales always thinks they know everything, right? They just do, right? They're just this sort of, I get it, but it's not true. And so I think that, yes, that's the right configuration for that thing. And then there should be a RevOps leader, which we can talk about, but that's a different whole thing.
Right. Well, obviously, when businesses or B2B businesses are competing for talent, right, and they need a marketing role, there might be an expectation that that role have the title Chief Marketing Officer as opposed to Vice President of Marketing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
I get it.
Even though, does that mean you should take those three second-tier roles and all make them a C role, right? Otherwise, then you end up with the imbalance of a
you're talking to a great problem. You're right. This, look, if I'm trying to recruit somebody, and look, the CRO role is the same thing. I mean, let's face it. There are a lot of reasons why the CRO role is even handed out in the first place is for this. I'm looking for a really great head of sales.
Right.
And if I make them a CRO, I'm more likely to get that person because they want that title. But this is the origin of this problem, is that people are recruiting people and people are enticed by the wrong things, and they actually end up creating problems, right? You sort of create monsters, Yeah. And I understand it. I'm not naive to the realities of the things. My job, and I'm doing a pretty good job of it right now, is to just make CEOs aware of this, right? And say, look what you're about to do. You're gonna go to market because you want this really smart X or this really smart Y or this really talented X, and you're gonna hang the C-suite role in front of them to entice them in. But what's the implications of that? Like, how is that going to impact the way you structure your organization? Have you thought about this stuff? Like, what's your plan to deal with the outcome of that decision? And most of them are like, I don't know, I just want the guy here, And so, if it's like, well, that's really kind of not enough. You really do have to think about this. And here's why, right? And if they look at the trajectory of that decision, they see the problems. A lot of them go, wow, I didn't think about this. And I really do need to be a little bit more think a little longer term, strategic about this, and entice the person different way, right? And so, or maybe give them that role, but communicate it or manage it differently. And so my optimal customer obviously is somebody who hasn't made these decisions yet, and I can kind of get out in front of them and I can help them create the right organization. There's plenty of companies that are in that position, but right now, most of the people I'm talking to are people who are in this problem. And they're like, man, I wish I spoke to you a year ago. I'm dealing with all this stuff you're talking about, and I get it now. But now I got to untangle a knot that I created, and that's hard to do. And the conversation becomes like, well, what's harder, untangling the knot or tightening it? And they know the answer, but it's just hard work. But it's necessary because companies need to kind of get over the challenges they already have, which is they're competitive. Most of them are. A lot of the companies I deal with are not, frankly. They're not differentiated, right? They're to a certain degree, they're commoditized businesses. And so they're fighting against things that this sort of stuff can actually help them in ways that trying to be competitive can't. So it's not a small thing, but it's a fun one. It's a fun one.
Right. So in situations where, a B2B marketer essentially has share of wallet opportunity, right? Mm-hmm. Where, it's not a one-trick pony kind of thing, like where you sort of sell it and walk away. Obviously, retention is key, but beyond retention, if there's an opportunity to sort of grab share of wallet, because not every dollar on that product or service is spent with you as the organization. That's another area where I've seen a lot of dysfunction as to who owns that, right? Because it could be in that area that you're referring to as ops, right? Like the upsell, cross-sell division of ops is sort of trying to squeeze more revenue out of that. It could be within marketing, who basically says, okay, well, we don't have, we're only at 45% share of wallet. We'd like to get to 75, or it could be sales saying, no, don't worry about it. We got the customer list. It's in our CRM. We'll take care of it, right? And so is there best practice with regards to just thinking that through?
I think there is. I mean, there's a general best practice. I mean, clearly I'd have to look at each organization uniquely to find out, like, there's a lot of aspects of this you could probably appreciate that need to be taken into account. But generally, the way I look at it is, once a customer has purchased a product or service and they're in the funnel as a customer, it's a customer success ownership, right? Because they own that relationship with the customer that's already consuming the service or product. And they're responsible for the customer experience, which unfortunately the customer experience isn't just, ended after they make the sale and they take the first taste. It's, how long, what's the customer lifetime value? And, how can we, like you said, how can we get more, efficiency, right, out of that customer? And I think those things fall squarely in the way in which the customer is being onboarded, and in the way the customer experiences that the product is being utilized, right? And I think that having that under, when you say ops, right? I mean, I think maybe you're referring RevOps. Is that what you were saying? Yeah, yes. So there's definitely a relationship. That's why I mentioned the RevOps before. So the way I look at it is, a revenue operations, and you probably know better than me, if not as well as me for sure, that the RevOps sector is blown up in the last year, right? There's all these really big RevOps superstars, and it's a big word, and it's an important one. And the complexities of running a revenue operation have made this role really important, which is why I hold it to be very important. And I think there needs to be what I call, it's almost like the CRO's chief of staff, the RevOps person. And that's the person who's responsible for that stuff, right? Who looks at the outcomes from a yield perspective, right? A profitability perspective, how do we onboard people? What are the metrics and measures that we use? What are the technologies that we use to manage all three of these organizations? And that person would be the one that would derive the right recipe for determining how to make that share of wallet increase. And I think that if I was a CRO, I'd be leaning on that person to say, look, here's what I want you to do. I want you to work closely with the product people, frankly, and with the customer success folks, and all the people that are already inside of our house who are, consuming our product or service. We need to have extremely close understanding and analysis of their experience. Like, when do they increase? When do they drop off? What's their consumption habits? When do they change their behaviors? Where are they dissatisfied? Where do we see the most value? How do we identify when the value is delivered, right? And how do we make sure that we deliver that value sooner or lengthier? And that RevOps person is going to be very closely tied to the product person around that customer success organization to make that determination. And then that would be rolled into sales, right? Then sales would know they should speak to the customer that way. Like, that's a great tool for a sales team to know, well, that's insightful. I want to speak to that when I'm trying to sell it to somebody, because that's going to tie directly back to their experience, right? Same with marketing. If marketing can now deliver a message into the marketplace to try and, like we both said, soften up the market, we should be speaking to those things, because the customers that we have are going to give us the best outcome insights to drive to the customers that we want. And this doesn't happen enough. So I think this is part of the way that a CRO should be thinking. And you could already hear, I think, that that's a pretty valuable role. If a CRO is really good at that, they're probably going to have a very, very good outcome track record, because they're going to have the right information putting into the right hands at the right time with the right relationships to make sure it works.
So obviously, most people listening to this, right, who are running B2B or B2C for that matter, organizations, they have an existing org chart, right, which may need to get blown up, right? And that may be very uncomfortable.
It is.
Along with that, how often do you also need to sort of blow up the entire comp structure, right? Because you've got scenarios where, sales doesn't just sell it once, they sell it endlessly. Like, if you think about the media business for years, right? It's like, every insertion order was a new sale, right? Nothing ever became a house account. And so it never really moved to RevOps. Like there was really like RevOps and sales, there was no differentiation, right? You had the hunter, but the hunter was also the farmer, right? And it's like, well, wait a minute, like, shouldn't we like think about this differently? There's people we already know, people we've gotten, annuity revenue from for 16 years. Like, do we really need the same salesperson for that versus the person we never talked to before? Right. And so it sounds like you sometimes have to blow up a lot at the same time. Right.
It's true. And, I think, look, I'm a bit of a, intentionally with what I'm trying to do, I'm intentionally a bit of a bull in a china shop, because I do think that these older, let's call them legacy operating models are they're not working anymore. I think we all know that, right? You get these SDR groups, right? And, they have ABM is a big part of things now. And all these things are understandable attempts to sort of, patch up ways in which we're trying to figure this stuff out. And I do believe, and maybe I'm obviously biased, but I'll double down on my opinion, that the CRO and revenue alignment role is really at the heart of all these problems, right? So if you take a look at the way the tech sector, particularly ad tech, martech, fintech, all this stuff, how these particular businesses have evolved, the way in which they're evolving forces these organizations to create silos, right? They're almost by design, like, because you're giving each one of these groups their own survival roadmaps, right? Here's how you're going to prove your existence, and here's how you're going to prove your existence, and here's how you're, right? So that alone is going to drive these things apart, because now I want to know that my contribution to the outcome is going to be credited. And I'm more interested in my getting credit for my contribution than the outcome. That's kind of dumb, and that's not good for business. Now, I haven't gotten into this with you, but I think it's important to note that what's causing all this is investment funding primarily, and the reason is because most of the companies you and I are talking about have a third party that's funding them, a VC or a PE or some other group that's invested in them, right? And if they don't have that, that's what they want, right? So they're vying to get someone to invest in them. So those two dynamics create cultures. So if I'm looking for money, or if I'm responding to the conditions and expectations that come with money, right? Those usually come in the form of, give me my money back, right? Make my money back, or make me feel good about my investment. And so the CEO is beholden to the board, who's responsible for that entity, who's doubling down on that expectation. That's where the top-down sales projections come from, always, right? I don't care how bottoms up they may be. It's not true. And everyone knows this. And so already I'm a CEO. So you tell me, if you're a CEO of a company today and you just got a $10 million round, and there's expectations that come with that round in terms of projections and in terms of, customer acquisition numbers, et cetera, profitability, et cetera. If I'm going to hire a chief revenue officer, my natural inclination is to make sure that chief revenue officer sells, because that's going to fulfill on my biggest concern, which is to make these guys happy. But you already heard me say, and I think you agree, that that's not good for the business, because the customers lose, because the focus isn't on them. It's on serving these guys, not the customers. So there's an endemic sort of like conflict in the way these businesses are structured, and that there's two masters, right? There's the customer, which everyone knows if they're happiest, right? Bezos would tell you this. I mean, all he cares about is customer satisfaction. He lost a lot of money for many, many years making the customer really happy. Now he's got the biggest business in the world, and he was right about this. Talk all you want bad about him. The fact is that the customer's satisfaction is number one, and that's what makes sense. So what we're trying to do is make CEOs aware of this dynamic, right? I don't know if it'll change. I mean, they're still going to have these issues, but more importantly, I'd like to have the VC investment community aware of this, right? Because if they're investing money into a company and they know that by virtue of making this investment, they're having an impact on the culture and the way the company is going to be focused, they should be aware of that, because it's actually counterintuitive for them to support that. It's kind of a weird counterintuitive thing. I use that word a lot, but it is. And I think this is a key part of this whole thing. And this is the end product that I see most of the time. Most of the time I see the CEO's concerns, right, are so clear that they're not able to make the decisions that make sense. They're ones that are making them they're kind of manage their survival in a way. And these are the ways in which this role that sits in the center of this is designed to sort of provide some solution to kind of unlock these problems. So that's kind of how I see this in a bigger picture.
Yeah, a lot of something we're also seeing, particularly for legacy organizations, maybe a little bit less so for sort of the newly funded startups, which make up potentially most of your sort of membership of your organization, but is sort of this either lack of data or bad data, regardless of whether that data is rolling up to somebody whose official title is CRO or not. There just isn't enough information. Like they don't understand their own 80/20 rule or power curve. They don't know they don't have a really good profile of the difference between their average customer and their very best customer, right? And then like who's going to own that, right? And it sounds like the way you're structuring that's the CRO's job, and
It
then
is. It
he
is.
potentially has to partner more closely, or she has to partner more closely with a CIO or a CTO, right, to
Yes.
make sure that data is collected. Obviously, marketing needs to be involved and sales needs to be involved because each of those folks are feeding this business intelligence, right, which doesn't exist in so many cases. But in the end,
Absolutely.
right, the CRO, since they own the revenue, right, at the top
Yeah.
level, they
You're
need to
100% right.
build
Yeah,
that, right? They need to
that's
build
right.
that.
And I'm working on that right now. One of my clients literally today said to me in the middle of this engagement, said, we don't know, like we're on a map in a way, but we don't really have a clear enough definition of like actually where we are right now. We sort of maybe know the neighborhood that we're in, right? We don't know what street we're on or the street address. And without that, we sort of can't really make a plan to go forward. And we've just never really put in the time because a lot of companies survive, right, on sort of this sort of organic just growth, and they're happy with it because the numbers add up at the end of the quarter. And then there are other companies who overcomplicate their metrics, right? They make them so complicated, they look at too much and they make every data point important, right? And it becomes really hard to obfuscate between what really matters and what doesn't. And they think anything we can measure needs to get attention. If you can measure everything, well, that's not a good thing. So to your point, yeah, you got to find what's the right stuff to measure, and they don't know sometimes to answer those questions. And it's the chief revenue officer's job for that first, I'd say 6 months on the job to sort of create clarity, right? And I have a sort of a framework for this, right? Framework is more on the functional side first, and that's where that kind of takes place, which is where are we really? Like how messed up are we, right? Where are the breakdowns here? And what do they mean for the customers in our organization? And the second part is I have partners I work with whom kind of come in at the tail end of that and then operationalize that through the stuff that you're talking about, right? So there's a tech stack. I mean, people have to reevaluate the tech they're using because look, software salespeople are great. Like they'll make you buy their stuff, right? And software as a strategy is a lot of ways that companies get out of this problem. Instead of figuring this out, what they do is they get, I'll use them as the bad guy. They get Salesforce and they adhere their company around Salesforce's requirements for input. And they build almost like a company that's based on a software platform, as opposed to building a strategy and then finding a software platform that sort of enables it, right? And that takes more work. It's easier to just have a Salesforce type company come in and just say, use our software and it'll sort of build this awareness for you. But it's based on their software, not your company, right? And a lot of it's right, but all companies are different. And the flexibility of these tools, Frank, it's not always as flexible as you think, And so I think that the sales technology and the advertising and marketing technologies tend to be the enemy a lot of times of these things because, well, we work this way. This is how we have to put in stuff. Look at our dashboards. And those things are driving their strategies as opposed to thinking about the business. And that's another big thing I encounter as well.
Right, right. Do you have any members of the organization that are B2C companies as well, or is it really more B2B?
No. And the reason is because, and this might change, I don't know if it will. The CRO model doesn't really fit well with a large scale consumer based business, right? As a matter of fact, my opinion, I think everyone would agree that the B2C companies, the B2C brands is where a CMO really thrives. Because if I'm selling a product, marketing is such a big part of the way that they create that sort of, audience loyalty. And I do believe that a creative not just the metrics driven, but a really good creative, smart messaging based CMO that has like two prongs, like a really strong ability to create value and communicate value in the marketplace, and also understand how to build customer pipelines, is a really important job. And I just don't think a CRO really is like a critical part of that organization. So all my clients are B2B, and I've made it clear that I only work with B2B companies because the problems I'm talking about are really germane to B2B companies, maybe even more so in the tech sector, which is still a pretty large part of B2B, but it's pretty big, right? So there's a lot of companies that are quote tech companies. And so that's, I think, where most of the stuff I'm talking about works. And that's the market that I serve. It's a nice size market, so it's okay.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I was just curious because
Yeah.
the I guess you'd call it the SaaS model, for
It
lack
is.
of a better term.
It is. It's
It has
SaaS
sort
for
of
sure.
broken through into consumer to some extent. I mean, you think
It
about,
has.
you know,
No
Netflix
doubt.
and other things that we buy on a
No doubt.
subscription basis. I mean, they even want you to
Subscription-based.
buy pet food on a subscription
Yeah,
basis.
that's a good point. I mean, now that you mention it, I could absolutely for sure see like a Roku or a Netflix having a CRO. That would make perfect sense to me because the business model does support that. I do think that the marketing side of it, right? When you think about a Netflix, right? What are they selling? They're selling content. They want people to watch a great show, right? And that's marketing, right? They have to produce content, which is the product, and they have to get it out to the market and put Jennifer Aniston on every poster and get people to want to watch it. And although I agree with you that I see that there's probably a place for a CRO in there somewhere, I just really haven't explored it enough. And I'll be honest with you, I don't really want to.
Yeah,
It's
no,
not
I
what I
was
want to do. But it's a good conversation, and it is interesting. I think there may be a cool talk about just how the model is moving over into some of these subscription-based businesses. It's a fair point, and it's one that's it's probably going to happen. It'll look different,
right, right. Um, I liked your comment about deciding your strategy first and then seeing whether an existing platform works for you, whether it's CRM or
or whatever one it is,
yeah, because you don't know what it is yet.
And there are so many platforms now that are made just for specific industries. They should be looked at, as opposed to just like a generic one.
Right.
So anyway, continue. I didn't want to interrupt.
So do you feel like that most CROs are even qualified to do that on their own, or should that be a committee? I mean, should that be Chief Information Officer plus CRO?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think that the CRO will bring a perspective to that conversation, right? That's an important one. It's not a small perspective. It's like the CRO is basically going to this group, which I think RevOps obviously would be critically important to that, right? That RevOps leader is probably someone who knows a lot about this stuff. And together they would formulate what the strategy is, and it would be driven by what are our revenue strategies. So if I've got this type of customer and this type of product, right, this type of sales cycle and this type of price point, right, this type of demo, and then I've got this type of pipeline and this type of runway, and then I've got this type of sales organization, et cetera, et cetera. A CRO is going to bring to bear all the aspects of that particular component to the conversation about, okay, here's the problem we're trying to solve for. What's the right technology that we use for this? And then the other people would weigh in and bring their perspective. And that's a collaborative conversation that they all together go, all right, well, we've done an analysis and we think that all these inputs mean this is the quadrant in which we should be looking for our tech stacks. And there's probably software that sits inside that's the right place to look. And then now you're being more specific, right? You're going to get a much different outcome, and you're going to ask much different questions, and you're going to vet these guys much differently, and the right one will more likely will emerge, as opposed to the one who just has a bigger budget and better salespeople, right? That's not the way it should win. And I think that the tech sector is really good at figuring out ways to convince people that they're the right one for them, and it's not always the case. They take advantage, in my opinion, of it's not negative, not like they're evil, but they just do. They sort of have the upper hand, right? I mean, if I walk into a conversation and I'm a tech seller, I'm selling software, I sort of have an audience that's sort of like, listening very intently because they're like, we don't know what to do. Help us figure this out. And they come to them as almost business strategy solutions, which, maybe they are. I don't want to argue they're not. At the end of the day, what you're really buying is you're buying an interface that has inputs and outputs, and right. And I think that there needs to be some sobriety with that maybe isn't there right now.
Right, right. Well, the name CRO Collective sort of connotates that there's some community going on. So is there
Yeah.
in fact a lot of knowledge sharing among members, separate from sort of your day job of actually providing the service to help people strategically think this stuff through? Do you have a peer-to-peer thing going on as well, or is that not really part of the whole offering?
It's most certainly is. And I've built all of the back end and front end of it. It's going to be launched imminently, and it's within like weeks. And the intent is, this is critical. So I'll give you the pillars of the business, right? Now that you mention that, right? So there's the community. Okay, so you hit it on the head, right? CROs need a community of peers with which they can collaborate on, right? I mean, if I'm a chief revenue officer and I can put down my armor, right, and my sword long enough to like listen to other ones, there's just a wealth of knowledge that CROs could share with each other about best practices, and I know, because I speak to them all the time, there's a big hunger for that. So the CRO Collective membership is going to in fact be a CRO only environment where there's going to be CROs who join as members, and they can have the opportunity via like a Slack channel, or so to speak, they can communicate with each other. And from that, now there can be other ways in which that community can be engaged with through my organization, which could be through trainings and learnings and speakers and stuff like that. Then there's a aspiring CRO group, which will be separate from that. Those are sales leaders and marketing leaders who want to become a CRO and are looking for ways to kind of increase their understanding of the role and sort of move up the scale. And then there's the CRO readiness program, which is for CEOs, and then the CRO program, which trains them. And then on the other side of it, there's the recruiting program. And I'm not getting into recruiting, but there's going to be a placement where if I'm a chief executive officer and I'm looking for a CRO, what better place to look for a CRO that's qualified than the CRO Collective, right? Because they've been trained and they're aware of this. And that will shorten up the vetting time and speed with which to get a CRO onboarded properly, and also mitigate the risks that come with hiring one, because they know they've sort of been pre-qualified. So there is a certification component to this. So I'm planning on certifying professional chief revenue officers so that they're really in the marketplace as someone who's kind of have some credential. They can say, look, I've gone through this training, and it makes me a little bit more clear on how to do things. So that's the bigger vision for the organization.
Great. Well, since it's imminent, obviously we don't know when people will be looking at this video, but is sort of the best bet for people to just find you on LinkedIn and reach out if they have an interest?
Yeah, so they can find me on LinkedIn. I'm the only Warren Zenna in the entire world, so I'm easy to find. and you can reach me at warren@thecrocollective.com, or they can go to my site, thecrocollective.com. And I have a lot of stuff there. There's other podcasts that you can listen to. I've wrote some articles and other white papers and other things, and I have some presentations. And I'll be doing a lot of speaking engagements over the next like 3 or 4 months, and some other partnerships that I'm working on right now that I'm really excited about. They're going to help me sort of extend some of the ways in which I'm delivering. So that's the best way to reach me.
Great. Well, thanks so much for sharing your vision. There's a lot in there, right? And I think there's also tremendous opportunity because things are still broken enough that someone needs to fix it.
100%. And look, I appreciate this. I love having this conversation, and your questions were really helpful and provocative. So thanks so much for your time as well.
My pleasure.